When Piper and Charon weaponized the primordial keys, the catastrophic detonation obliterated Makthum Nagatha and the vast expanses of the Far Realm. Many of the great old ones within the Far Realm stirred from their eons-long slumber when the nine-tongued worm was slain. Some awoke for only a fleeting instant before being consumed by the torrent of cataclysmic destruction, while others took note from their vantage in the infinite gyre, their reactions ranging from alien approximations of rage to the unfamiliar sensation of fear. Untold ages would pass before the Far Realm fully recovered, but one thing was certain. The companions would never again know anonymity, not even in a dimension as remote and unknowable as the Far Realm. With the combined efforts of Cord and Bastion, the Tarrasque was prevented from demolishing Metzen, and in its corrupted state, perhaps the entirety of the continent. The beast of Ragnarok was dragged into the Far Realm and vanquished in a detonation akin to a dying star. In the years that would follow, the impact of the Tarrasque's absence would be realized. Though the periodic rampages of the Tarrasque would not be missed by the denizens of Creston, the creature was bonded to the material plane itself, acting in some capacity as an avatar to the Earth. The damage to the World Tree when it was poisoned, the weakening of the Druidic ley line, and the sudden severing of the connection to the Tarrasque resulted in the disappearance of Druidic magic. The inability to call upon nature magic without a fey pact or clerical bond would relegate Druid circles to schools of philosophy and nature-based ethics. Outside of Alundar, Druids became so rare that they attained a mythical status, most people never meeting a true Druid in their lifespan. When Lolth died the final death in the fields north of Metzen, the web of deceit upon which she had built her power began to unravel. The Drow, already significantly weakened by their losses in Hammerfell, would soon fall prey to the Illithids. Mind flayers fleeing the surface after the failed conquest of the nine-tongued worm would mercilessly crush and subjugate the remaining Drow. 9 of 10 Drow would perish in a genocide of ravenous consumption over the next year, and those who remained were turned into thralls. Illithids established an incomprehensibly complex colony which spanned the Underdark and became the supreme power below the surface, utterly replacing the empire of the Drow. Cord, Farlongen, and Lord Byron were all destroyed in the Battle of the Dirge. Corm's population was decimated, and worship of the battle god was at a historic low. Only the fervor of his most ardent surviving acolytes kept the embers of his faith alive and viable. Farlongen passed the mantle of his divinity to Charon the Traveler, and his efforts to rebuild the world saw an expansion of the already widespread faith. For Cord, Farlongen, and Lord Byron the Dawnbringer, it took years of dedicated worship to restore the possibility of an avatar or embodiment to walk the prime material plane. But in time, through great feats of reverence, they were restored. Though the world was spared from annihilation, the ley lines were damaged by Makthum Nagatha both prior to and during the War of Rending. Perhaps the most significant lasting effect was that the magic in Creston became far less stable and predictable than it had previously been. The fractures and frays along the ley lines meant that magic could surge in wild and erratic ways, arcane energies roiling and exploding with even the simplest of spells. The greater the amount of energy pulled from a ley line, and the closer the proximity to it, the greater the potential magnitude of its random effects. This change caused an increased reliance on technology and science. The instability and unreliability of magic bred a culture of distrust from the common folk. pre-rending enchantments and items retained their stability, however, and became highly prized, as any magical item forged after the War of Rending was unreliable at best and hazardous at worst. After his defeat at the hands of the companions at Hammerfell, Wendenai was banished from the Prime Material Plane for 100 years. When Lolth was destroyed, she left a Spider Queen-sized power vacuum in the abyss, and Wendenai had a century of uninterrupted scheming during which to take advantage. Eventually, the Balor would claw his way into the position of a lesser demon lord, not the equal of Demogorgon or Orcus, but powerful and dangerous enough to make either wary. He assumed the role of a lesser god and inherited the portfolio elements of spiders and treachery from his mistress, and he schemed against the companions whenever possible. The heart of the nation of Daelin would bear the scar of Lolth's conquest for all time. The Valley of Ruination would be called the Rending, a geographical feature spanning hundreds of miles. The northern tip of the Rending swallowed the city of Griffin's Peak, and the southern tip was less than a day's ride from Metzen. The indelibly blighted landscape became a warped nightmare of chaotic corruption. The flora and fauna were abyssal in nature, twisted and aberrant. Though Piper and Kit funded many studies to restore the region, and Thorum and Charon attempted to cleanse it, the Rending persisted, a painful reminder of what lies waiting in the darkness. Marius Valorium, king of Metzen, continued to work with the members of the Alliance until his death. Treaty modifications and legislative erosion eventually transformed the Alliance into little more than trade agreements and emissary obligations, but for half a century, political unity of the Alliance endured, and its members contributed towards a cooperative effort for the betterment of all nations, commoner and noble, from Azamar to Tiefling, together as one. The War of Rending left these three nations of the East depopulated and shattered militarily. Chaos reigned throughout the region in the years to follow. Rebellion in Avernium, bandits in Eren Galen, and competing remnants of barbarian clans in Korm left the East a lawless frontier. The demons of the Dirge offered societal stability and a transition to law and order. Gutternock constructed a citadel at the intersection of the three kingdoms. Through a series of real estate and land acquisitions which were suspiciously cunning and favorable, the demon's commander carved a sizable kingdom from the broken region, while it was at its most vulnerable. This new mercenary fiefdom would come to be known as Devil's Fork. With the advent of stable trade and favorable tariffs, Nethrandil established itself as a significant trade route between the free cities of Thres and Daelin. Acerabax was primarily interested in accumulating arcane knowledge. His occasional military ambitions were quickly thwarted by an ever-vigilant Charon, who monitored the region closely. How the fate of Nethrandil might have been different, for good or ill, under the influence of Gilthanas Pharaneus, the world would never know. With the military of Voldenvale eradicated by the War of Rending, the nation found the most pragmatic solution to be a permanent alliance with Orin. The gnomes and halflings combined their governments and borders to form Orinvale. Culturally, gnomes and halflings initially mixed like oil and water. Halflings, ever hospitable and gregarious, had an awkward collision with the gnomish proclivity for inventive isolation and stark individualism. As years passed, gnome generations became, if only by degrees, more sociable and welcoming. Halflings, in turn, learned to place greater value and recognition on the contributions and innovations of individuals. Clovis Anvilcracker returned from the War of Rending, with the shields of Moradin suffering virtually no casualties. Drub and Thorum helped the Dwarven monarch to organize and then rebuild not only Hammerfell, but the many regions of the Alliance. Meat, Mead, and Moradin spread the culinary and cultural traditions of the dwarves to every corner of Creston, while Thorum and the Shields of Moradin trained recovering and newly formed armies around the continent. With myriad human communities damaged by the Nine-Tongue Worm's machinations, dwarf society became the bedrock upon which nations were rebuilt in the post-Rending world. In the aftermath of the Battle of the Dirge, Rhaegar and the Dragonborn clans negotiated a treaty known as the Pact. The chromatic dragons of the Beyond agreed to maintain a semblance of order in the wilds beyond Tiamat's spine, preventing constant incursions, and in kind, the Dragonborn would guard the pass and prevent harassments of dragons by adventurers seeking their treasure. With the Chalice of Bahamut, the Dragonborn created a new order of metallic paladins who acted as champions for their people, Rhaegar the first among them. Side by side with the dwarves of Darlothal, the Dragonborn reclaimed the entirety of the Plains of Blood. No longer a perpetual war zone, they named it Dastarathel, or in Draconic, Dragonhome. The elves became less isolationist for the first time in millennia, opening their borders to other Alliance nations. Pockets of dissent cited the murder of one of their diplomatic representatives in Metzen, but the investigations into this were inconclusive. The introduction of dwarven barbecues, fizzletop inventions, dragonborn comedy, and halfling carnivals rocked the elven cultural landscape. The cultural purity that the elves had maintained was shattered, but in its place blossomed an enduring connection to the other races of Creston. As druidic magic failed throughout the world, it persisted in the ebonleaf forests of Alundar, where the reverence for nature and druidic magic derived from it had never wavered. When Kord was slain, Gawain and Thorum set aside their differences in order to work on their shared goal, restoring the god of battle. Resurrecting a slain god requires tremendous devotion and ritual, and so Thorum, Gawain, Valgard, and Gamog founded the Gauntlet of Glory, a competition held every 4 years in which every nation, both from the mainland and foreign continents, send their greatest champions to compete in feats of skill, strength, and athleticism. The entire event, which lasts a fortnight, is an extended ritual dedicated to the tenets of Kord, and in time it saw his place in the Creston Pantheon restored. Gawain, working side by side with the Alliance members, had a change of heart concerning the role of cooperation. It was not, as he had thought previously, a sign of weakness to call on your friends for assistance. Gawain and Thorum competed against each other in various events of the Gauntlet over the years, each getting the better of the other at different turns. Gawain did not assume the mantle of lordship his father had abdicated. The man once known as the Dragon Lord was content to live the rest of his days as a competitor, mentor, and sometimes champion of the Gauntlet, joining its judges panel upon his retirement to ensure that contests were fairly assessed. After defending the city he had always loved from demons of the abyss and eldritch horrors, Inimicus passed the proverbial torch to the next generation of the Watch. He took on a lucrative contract as a personal bodyguard to a wealthy half-elf client. Gossip in the Metzen court rumored that she was an heiress with an interest in scholarship and archaeology. Some years after his resignation from the Watch, he was spotted in the Metzen marketplace, 2 tiefling children of fair complexion and pointed ears trailing behind him. It is reported that he had to return the contents of no less than 9 picked pockets, apologetically insisting that they take after their mother. During the second Gauntlet of Glory held in Metzen, Gamog received the gold laurel in single combat and feats of strength. After the campaign he undertook with Baga in Avernium, he journeyed to Dalu in the Far East and remote Bergdale in the Oceans of Dawn, seeking out the most fearsome predators and masterful warriors. He returned years later with scars and tales from dragons slain, krakens tamed, and titans toppled. With every nook and cranny of Creston explored, he asked Charon to craft him a pair of boots which could bring him to new worlds with new challenges. Where did he go? What glory did he find? The only certainty is that somewhere in the multiverse, Gamog Stonebreaker is punching something mighty in the face. The goblin assassin had several conversations with Caselli Cinderhoof before she was slain in the Battle of the Dirge, and much like her, he despised slavers. Baga spent nearly 10 years terrorizing Rashar the Stone Talon, God Emperor of Avernium. He waged a rebellion of brutal ambushes, often mocking the psionic forces of the Emperor for not seeing him coming. The revolution eventually led to the formal abolition of slavery in Avernium, and the dissolution of imperial rule. Baga found folk hero infamy unsavory, though, and to avoid the accusations of altruism, he next lent his services to the highest bidders in the Blood War. Both sides. Sometimes simultaneously. Neither demons, nor devils, nor dictators spelled the goblin's doom. That honor fell to an exotic dish served to the elderly assassin by Drub. The spice-drowned delicacy, a curried ankeg. Allergies, alas. Upon hearing of Lord Byron's demise, Flynn dedicated himself to spreading tales of the history and exploits of the mighty steed. Flynn owed everything to Byron. He had saved his brother from the vampires, journeyed through the 9 hells to recover his soul, and ultimately sacrificed himself to save the world from the 9-tongued worm. In his devotion to this cause, he spent many long hours with Mercy, chosen cleric of Pelor. Though they made an unlikely couple, it was scarcely the first time that a rogue with a heart of gold and a cleric with a penchant for adventure wound up together, romantically intertwined. Rumor has it that Flynn was only accepted into Elysium upon his passing because Byron and Mercy vowed that he would be on his best behavior. King Marius Valorium of Metzen and the council presented Cecil with a formal decree of lordship, offering him lands, titles, and retainers in exchange for his services to the realm and the alliance. Cecil declined the hullabaloo with a simple, "No thank you." With Corvax, crusher of nuts, pulling his cart, and Bertrand at his side, he returned to the quaint village of his birth, where he had first met the companions, Dornshire. He used some of his considerable fortune from adventuring to renovate his inn and tavern, rebranding it Beers, Beef, and Byron, a heartfelt, if derivative ode to 3 of his favorite things. He settled down with a local girl who was entirely too pretty for him, and doted on his 2 children, Violet and Valen, both of whom loved his bedtime stories, which detailed his many adventures, though both also insisted he was having them on with the bit about riding a dragon. After accidentally finding himself in the position of saving the world not once, but twice, Crossbow James decided to do something simple, something foolproof. The snarky goblin said that he was going on a vacation to Avernium, to see the sights and take in the nightlife. What could possibly go wrong? Upon arriving, Baga kindled a rebellion which would free the people of an entire nation and leave the bodies of their oppressors strewn behind them in a wake of carnage and liberation. After the first democratic elections were held, Crossbow James was astonished to find that he had been elected the head of the Avernium Democratic Council. A president, in their language, but close enough to a king as James understood the job description. He relied heavily on experts and advisors, and managed to be re-elected for several terms, fumbling his way into a prosperous and egalitarian nation. After being recruited by the demons of the Delves, Raylan fought at the front lines of every major engagement in the War of Rending. He earned acclaim and distinction among their ranks, slaying mind-flayers, beholders, demons, and drow in a bloody tour across the continent, thanks to the clerics of Farlangen. Gutternock, always possessed of a keen eye for talent, promoted the lad upon each successful mission. Raylan eventually became a general in the demons' armies, earning the nickname Darksbane. When Gutter disappeared, it was Raylan who kept the soldiers paid, assignments organized, and ledgers in the black. When he retired from the mercenary outfit, only in his middle age, he would go on to join the dragonborn paladin order, the Knights of Bahamut. When Gutter asked why in the 9 hells he would want to go to being such a goody two-shoes, he replied, "To atone for the many indiscretions of my youth, which seemed unavoidable in the company of the fine scoundrels who were my brothers-in-arms. Sir." The world after the Rending was often a bleak and dismal affair. Reconstruction efforts were an eyesore upon many of the capital cities, and unwashed laborers crowded the boulevards from Darlothal to Gilead. Life seemed a dingy and squalid business, but never when Ilkamos was in town. Prior to the Rending, Ilkamos applied his considerable arcane gifts to perfecting a portable demiplane, the entrance to which was manifest as a resplendent manor. Ilkamos traveled in a rotation to each of the capital cities, enthralling the nobility with his coruscating repartee, impeccable fashion sense, and acumen for interior design. Noble ladies gushed in hushed tones about every immaculate detail of his galas. The chandeliers, the elven furniture, his gilded cravat. He assuaged the doldrums and despondency of damsels in a dozen districts, and made a handy profit besides, selling his designs and glamours. Occasionally, a spurned suitor would accost him. Blast marks and soot on the carpet were a nuisance, but what else is mending good for? A cantrip scarcely costs a copper, but a pristine dining hall is priceless. After aiding Darlothal and the other members of the Alliance with reconstruction efforts, Drubb had an appetite. A literal appetite, of course, but not only an appetite for new flavors, but new experiences, new faces, new potential converts to the Triple M way of life. After kicking about several planes, gathering recipes and ingredients, Drubb set up his permanent and most famous branch of Meat, Mead, and Moradin in Sigil, the city of doors. Travelers of all sorts made their way to the dwarf's establishment, and Drubb spread dwarven hospitality, inebriation, and indigestion to every intrepid individual imaginable. He once boasted to Charon that food from his kitchen had been defecated on more planes of existence and crystal spheres than any mortal creature in the history of the cosmos. A comment which left the Dragonborn uncharacteristically speechless. As the chosen of Pelor, Mercy was at the forefront of restoring the broken regions of the Alliance, bolstering followers of the faith with deeds of charity and service far and wide. At each temple she would visit, she would encounter the scoundrel Flynn Kavanaugh. He worked tirelessly to tell the story of Byron the Dawnbringer to the common folk, and to ensure that statues and shrines were constructed across the kingdoms. Mercy ended up breaking bread with the rogue frequently, and was surprised at how often he made her laugh. It wasn't entirely clear to her when or how it was that they fell in love, but she woke up one day simply knowing this to be true. She never forgot Valen. The irascible wizard in his damnable tower would always be close to her heart, but she allowed herself some measure of happiness. They continued their work together, two devoted to their calling to raise children, but inseparable nonetheless. They would ride from temple to temple, holding hands, both out of affection and to prevent Flynn's hands from wandering, in one way or another. Ragnar, Ludovic, nearly every person Valgard had ever known was annihilated in the War of Rending. The Shiverpeak Valley and Corm as a whole sacrificed nearly everything. Kilmeaden lost much of the potency of its protective walls when the primordial key was excavated from it. The alliance of clanholds that Ludovic Wolfson had brought together were wiped from existence by Kostya. Valgard found himself a man without a people, without a home, without a culture, and without a god. He made it his intense and all-consuming focus to restore Cord and his ways to the people of Creston, helping to found the Gauntlet of Glory. When Cord's divine connection to Creston was at last restored, his avatar appeared on the prime material plane during the Gauntlet of Glory's finale, and he grasped Valgard's forearm, his eyes flashing thunderous storms, and declared him a demigod, the lord of berserkers and the aspect of the wolf. From that day forward, Valgard was the instrument of Cord's vengeance, a fury to be unleashed upon the forces of corruption and darkness, his way always lit by a flash of lightning and heralded by a bone-chilling howl. As a demigod in the service of Pelor, Byron was quite diminished from the ordeal of being slain by Kostya. Flynn Kavanagh of Kavanagh Caravans made it his life's work to restore Byron's divine standing and spread the tale of his sacrifice. In time, Lord Byron the Dawnbringer became a minor deity in his own right, assuming the portfolio of worship for the bonds of friendship, particularly as a deity prayed to by diplomats hoping to forge and preserve alliances. When Mercy passed from this world, she found him waiting in Elysium, where they shared many rides through the golden fields, where the soil underhoof was soft and the apples ever ripe. When Charon summoned his soul to the world of the living, Plod initially declined to return. Kit was transported bodily to Celestia, where he negotiated fiercely with Plod until an agreement could be made. After the guarantee of a substantial raise and 2 weeks' annual vacation, Plod capitulated and allowed himself to be resurrected. He remained in Kit's employment, but stopped his work in the experimental capacity when he astounded Kit by developing and building the PLOD, a construct of the Prototype Laboratory Observation Diagnostician designation. After the Golem became Mr. Fizzletop's primary prototype tester, Plod spent much of his time on the clock preparing tea and sandwiches, while his off hours were allocated to toiling over a manuscript of his personal memoirs. After his gruesome and untimely demise at the hands of Thorum in the Siren's Booty Tavern of Hambry, Davy found himself compelled by Scaldrian's song to return to the prime material plane. Along with tens of thousands of other fallen souls, he manifests as a spectre, conscripted into an army of ghosts, tasked with saving the world from imminent destruction. Running with the throng of spirits, he charged an eldritch deity. Witness Bastion and Cord driving the Tarrasque into the portal of the far realm. And as the protective globe of magical energies protecting Kostya finally failed, Davy broke through the barrier and punched the avatar of Makthum Nagatha in the face, scattering rats into the air, hurling them into a distant dimension. The last thing he heard was the squeals of vermin, a smile on his ghostly lips as his soul was erased from existence. Gutter was a tiefling with a very particular set of skills, and that set of skills was most profitable when things were bad. Luckily for the commander of the demons of the Delves, the rending left the entire world worse for the wear. Keeping Skaldrian, the Dirge of Ragnarok, Gutter began taking lessons from the lute on how to play properly. Since the Battle of the Dirge became world famous, the commoners began referring to his mercenary company as the Demons of the Dirge, and eventually the branding stuck. With a trifling loan from a wealthy acquaintance, the tiefling carved out his own kingdom from bits of Corm, Erin Galen, and Avernium, calling it Devil's Fork. All seemed right with the world. He was rich, invited to fancy parties where he could eat and drink ungodly amounts, and then wake up to a bottle of what ails you, making his hangover evaporate. Life was sweet, until one morning Gutter caught the fetid scent of what he suspected was Black Dragon's breath on the wind. It was the thief. He reached for his bow, but the portal beneath him, cast perpendicular to the mattress upon which he was laying, swallowed him whole. After recovering from the stomach-churning disorientation of being portaled, Gutter gazed about an arid landscape of blasting sand and fragments of bone. A ubiquitous desert stretched out in all directions, the caw of some otherworldly bird the only sound to interrupt the whistling wind. Stranded on a plain he had never visited, with only his kukri and his small clothes, he spat into the swirling sands. He'd been through worse. 2 years later he emerged from a portal at the entrance to his citadel in Devil's Fork, bellowing for a steak. The multiverse was only so big, and there was a score to settle. Imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, and in emulation of Farlongen, Charon continued his eternal sojourn. Between traversing the plains, charting spelljammers, and visiting distant crystal spheres, Charon worked to ameliorate the ails of his own world. Though the rending could not be mended, he placed intermittent traveler shrines along its path and kept the temples well staffed, their clerics versed in combat and the healing arts in equal measure. In the aftermath of the Battle of the Dirge, Charon assisted Rhaegar in negotiating the pact with the chromatic dragons of the Beyond, allowing the Dragonborn to reclaim their homelands. Darstarathel ushered in a renaissance of culture, craftsmanship, and political influence for the Dragonborn. Charon's brother finally fulfilled his potential, embracing his role as the leader of the Knights of Bahamut. One of the first members of the Paladin Order, Ashara Thundermaw, took a liking to Charon during one of his visits. Some weeks later, when he was set to depart, she decided to travel with him. With Ashara by his side, he kept a close eye on the Sarabax of Nethrandil, thwarting his most nefarious plans before they came to fruition. In time, he fully restored Farlongen's divine connection to Creston. The Dweller on the Horizon requested that Charon continue to speak softly for a Dragonborn, and carry a large staff, protecting his crystal sphere from threats both planar and domestic. Big things come in small packages, so the saying goes, and Kit Fizzletop fairly exemplified it. No haughty historian could have ever predicted that so small a fellow would shape the world as Kit did. When magic went wild, people began to seek stable solutions to problems which used to be solved by simple spells, for no spell was simple after the rending. Kit leveraged his partnership with the Crimson Crow Mercantile, and with Karis Cladent as his partner, brought about a new technological era. With House Drummond's collapse, the Black Badger became defunct, and the Crimson Crow quickly became the most prevalent general goods store on the continent. Kit experienced an unmanageable level of economic prosperity, becoming the wealthiest gnome alive. He was initially uncertain how to spend his prodigious profits, But, as usual, Gutternock had an idea. The tiefling took out a titanic loan for a commensurately ambitious plan: to found a country of mercenaries, by mercenaries, for mercenaries. Well, for a mercenary in any event, as Gutter envisioned himself in the role of king mercenary, intending to pay back the loan with the taxes he would giddily collect. Kit bankrolled the incorrigible ranger and made sure that the initial drafts of his constitution were ethically and financially sound. It helped his conscience that the demons brought peace to a region rife with instability. After reading the Book of Exalted Deeds, Kit found that with great glowing comes great responsibility. He invested in research to investigate the wild magics erupting from the ley lines, possible ways to heal the rending, and invented 1,000 different things to better the lives of the common folk of Creston. But all of his fame and ingenuity would be eclipsed by his one most popular invention. What ails ya? The elixir was one of Kit's rare forays dabbling in alchemy, and though it was infuriating to him, the potion outsold the Kitapult, the Kit Boom explosives, and the Plod 2.0 by embarrassing margins. The effects were dead simple. It was an immediate and infallible cure for intoxication. Kit Fizzletop became the name on the lips of every drunkard and noble socialite the world over. Blessed by millions of vomit-spattered lips, they would gaze amiably at the label bearing his image and whisper, "My hero." When Kostya was finally defeated, Piper spent many months studying the rending itself, working with Necromiel, Bartleby Oakenstaff, and Kit on several experiments to reverse the corruption inflicted by Lolth. She spent her days performing field research and her nights in Inimicus's arms. That first year a strange collision of frustration and satisfaction. The project led the Keeper to finally master the Prime Key's ability to manipulate time. For Inimicus, Kit, and the rest of the world, a single year passed as they attempted to study and repair the rending. For Necromiel and Piper, however, it was closer to a decade. For each day spent, Necromiel and Piper spent nearly a week, exhausting every option they could conjure between them. Even an infinite well of research could not avail them in removing the blight marring Daelin. They eventually were forced to concede that the effects were permanent. Piper found time for distractions, not only with her straight-laced tiefling paramour, but in her continued feud with the mercenary who now fancied himself a monarch. With a considerable sum paid to a goddess of divination, Piper discovered that she had been the recipient of a curse, callously bestowed upon her by none other than Gutter. To teach him a lesson, Piper snuck into his bedchamber and sent him to a world as barbaric as he was. He would find his way back, she was certain. Eventually. And perhaps he would discover some manners along the way. Several years later, Gutternock did indeed return to his home plane. Piper kept her guard up, sure that retaliation was imminent. The commander of the Demons of the Dirge did not, however, send sellswords to find her. As always, the tiefling employed the most effective strategy: the unanticipated. He wrote a memoir. Or perhaps he had it ghostwritten. It detailed all the events of his life, from before the companions met, through his ordeal returning to Creston from the world he called Athos. The book was read by every sentient creature with eyeballs. It sold more copies than the hymns of Pelor, and every syllable was libel. Any halfwit who read the tiefling's tome repeated the infuriating and slanderous contents. Every fact about her presented in the book was a fabrication. She was not a dog person. She emphatically did not love tea. It was really just dirty water, no matter how much honey you put in it. And she never seduced and robbed the nobility of Metzen, and then inadvertently impaled a man with a grappling hook. Her reputation was in shambles. But she had her own notions of the power of suggestion and public opinion. Gutter loved his taxes, but the citizens of Devil's Fork, with the right pamphlets scattered about, might just be in the mood for some good old-fashioned insurrection. Thorim worked alongside Valgard, Gamog, and Gawain to found the Gauntlet of Glory, a festival of competition which united the members of the Alliance and eventually every foreign nation in the world in honoring Kord. Every 4 years the contest was held, with greater numbers of participants and spectators. In the finale of the third Gauntlet of Glory, Kord manifests his avatar, reclaiming his place in the Pantheon of Creston. His first act was to raise Valgard to the status of a demigod in his service. He then selected Thorim as his chosen, naming him the Voice of Kord. When the War of Rending had ended, Thorim had 3 goals: to help rebuild the Alliance, to restore his god, and to bring back the souls of those destroyed by Makthum Nagatha. The divine energy flowing through his veins rendered Thorim immune to the mind-altering effects of the Far Realm, enabling him to pursue his final objective. Thorim called upon the mightiest genies to grant his wish, sought out potent artifacts, and roamed the Far Realm, searching for the souls of his brother and friends. Each great Old One he encountered attempted to communicate the hopelessness of his journey. No matter how he threatened them, they could not resurrect that which had been unmade, any more than they could will the 9-tongued worm back into existence. In his fury, Thorim Barlock spread the legend of Wolf Mountain into the furthest recesses of the multiverse. It was a dark tale, written in the blood of slaughtered gods. He roamed from one landscape of astral abstraction to the next, carnage and terror stretching behind him like a shadow. Karen eventually found him, the Barlock cleaver buried in the skull of a god who had been ancient when the 9 hells were formed. Not driven mad by the Far Realm's ability to corrupt the mind, but driven to the brink of insanity by the sea of vengeance roiling within him, unable to process the senseless loss of those he had loved. "What damned good is strength if you can't protect those closest to you?" he roared at Charon, in the ever-shifting flux of the alien dimension which he had soaked in blood and ichor. Charon suggested that living was the best way to honor those they'd lost, and that revenge is not life, but a ravenous beast who cannot be sated, its appetite only multiplied. With a heavy heart, Thorim said goodbye to his brother, to his lost friends, and to the dwarf he had been before the rending. He left his axe and his rage behind him. He would fight for the rest of his long life, but from that day forward, it would be for the living. Of all of the shrines constructed at Flynn Kavanaugh's request, the largest and most famous was constructed at the southern tip of the Rending, where Makthum Nagatha and the Tarask were finally defeated. This monument was a tower, as Valen would have wished, and each stone was inlaid with an engraved adamantine plate. The plates included the names of all those who had sacrificed their very souls to shield the citizens of the Alliance.